Imagine you've just been handed a roadmap to your own potential. I mean, since you're listening to this deep dive, you're likely already familiar with the basic dichotomy of Dr. Carol Dweck's research.
Right, the terms we hear everywhere now.
Exactly. We've all heard growth mindset and fixed mindset tossed around in corporate seminars or, parenting blogs, educational newsletters.
The textbook definitions are practically pop psychology at this point.
They really are. But today, we aren't just looking at those definitions. We are taking a massive stack of clinical research, historical data, and physiological studies to look at the actual mechanics of this framework.
Which is such a critical distinction to make.
Yeah.
Knowing the definitions is one thing, but understanding the invisible architecture of how these mindsets operate under the surface is entirely different.
Yeah, so our mission today is to figure out why some insanely talented people just crash and burn, while seemingly ordinary people achieve absolute greatness. We're going to examine how these deeply ingrained beliefs hijack our physical brainwaves, our romantic relationships, and even multi-billion-dollar corporate cultures.
And as we start unpacking this material, I want you, the listener, to picture the backdrop for today's analysis. Imagine a vast, evolving library.
Okay, like that?
Picture endless rows of shelves. Some contain completed volumes, others have blank pages still being written, and there are staircases stretching up into spaces we can't quite see yet.
Wow.
This environment represents the human brain's infinite capacity to learn, to grow, and to physically rewire itself over time through neuroplasticity. It's a visual anchor for the mechanics we're about to explore.
It's a really fitting environment, considering where this entire field of study began, because Dr. Dweck didn't set out to create this binary system of mindsets. She was initially just a researcher trying to understand how individuals cope with failure.
Right, because the standard psychological assumption was that people generally just fell onto a spectrum of coping mechanisms.
Yeah, like some handled it adequately, others handled it poorly.
Exactly. So she designed a study to observe this in real time. She brought 10-year-olds, one at a time, into a room and gave them a series of puzzles.
And the initial puzzles were entirely age-appropriate, right?
They were, but the subsequent ones were deliberately designed to be too difficult for them to solve.
So she was setting them up to fail.
Yes, because the expectation was straightforward. She wanted to observe the varying degrees of frustration and disengagement. She anticipated seeing a decline in confidence, maybe some defensive posturing, or the kids simply giving up.
Which makes sense. That's what you'd expect a 10-year-old to do.
Absolutely. What she didn't expect was an entirely different category of response. When confronted with puzzles they fundamentally could not solve, one 10-year-old boy pulled up his chair, rubbed his hands together, and announced, "I love a challenge."
I love that.
And another student, who was struggling significantly with the task, looked up and stated, I was hoping this would be informative.
Which is an incredibly bizarre reaction to failure if you're operating from a traditional paradigm. I mean, Dweck actually noted that her first thought was that these children must be aliens.
It completely defied the established understanding of human ego protection.
It really did. But when we look closer at the underlying mechanics, it makes perfect sense. These children weren't anomalous. They simply didn't view the difficult puzzle as a metric of their inherent intelligence.
Right. They understood that intellectual skills are cultivated through effort.
They didn't see the threat of failure at all. They just saw the process of learning happening in real time.
And that anomaly is the bedrock of the entire stack of research we're looking at today. It led to the formalization of the two mindsets.
Let's lay those out clearly for everyone listening.
So in the fixed mindset, the belief is that your qualities are carved in stone. You possess a predetermined amount of intelligence, a specific personality, a static moral character.
You just get what you get.
Exactly. And because of that belief, every single situation becomes an urgent test of those static qualities. If you only have a set amount of ability, you are under constant pressure to prove that it is a high amount.
And on the flip side,
conversely, the growth mindset operates on the premise that the hand you were dealt is merely the starting point for development. Basic qualities are things you can cultivate through effort, strategic adjustment, and external input.
And it's important to clarify this because the research is very specific. The growth mindset doesn't imply that anyone can become Albert Einstein or Ludwig van Beethoven simply by trying hard enough.
Right. It's not a magic wand.
No, not at all. What it asserts is that a person's true potential is fundamentally unknown and unknowable. You simply cannot foresee what a human being can accomplish with years of passion, toil, and targeted training.
But the misunderstanding of this concept goes back well over a century. Look at Alfred Binet, the inventor of the IQ test.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Today, the IQ test is almost universally, culturally accepted as the ultimate metric of fixed intelligence. We treat it as a permanent number assigned to your brain.
Like it's tattooed on you at birth.
Exactly. And it is one of the greatest historical ironies in modern psychology, because Alfred Binet did not invent the IQ test to measure unchangeable intelligence.
Right, he was a Frenchman working in Paris in the early 20th century.
Yes, and he was tasked with designing a test to identify children who were not profiting from the Paris public school system. The objective was not to label these children as inherently deficient.
But to identify them so that new, targeted educational programs could be designed to get them back on track. He was trying to identify where the system was failing the student, not proving that the student was a failure.
Precisely. He actually wrote a book called Modern Ideas About Children, where he explicitly protested against what he called the brutal pessimism of philosophers, who asserted that an individual's intelligence is a fixed quantity.
Brutal pessimism, that's a powerful phrase.
It is. He argued that with practice, training, and method, individuals manage to increase their attention, memory, and judgment, literally becoming more intelligent than they were before.
So we have a society that took an instrument designed to facilitate growth and literally weaponized it into a tool for fixed categorization.
And that categorization trickles down into how we process mundane daily events. Dweck established a clinical baseline for this using a very simple hypothetical vignette.
Let's walk the listener through this one.
Okay, so the researchers asked young adults to imagine going through a cascading series of minor setbacks in a single day. You get a midterm paper back in the class you really care about, and you see a C+ print.
Ouch. Okay.
On the way home, you discover you've gotten a parking ticket.
The worst.
And then you call your best friend event, and they brush you off because they're busy.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second here. If I get a C+ on a test I studied for, get hit with a $50 parking fine, and then get ignored by my friend, I am going to be highly annoyed. Isn't that just a standard human reaction? Are the researchers suggesting that a growth mindset means you just smile and whistle through a terrible afternoon?
Not at all. There's a vast psychological difference between experiencing frustration and experiencing an identity collapse.
An identity collapse.
Yes. When researchers presented this scenario to individuals operating within a fixed mindset, their responses weren't just about annoyance. They were about fundamental worth.
What did they say?
They recorded responses like, "I'd feel like a reject, I'm a total failure," or "the world is out to get me."
Wow.
The coping mechanisms they described were entirely defeatist. Staying in bed, getting drunk, lashing out at someone else. They took non-catastrophic situational events
A single grade, a bureaucratic fine, a poorly timed phone call.
and internalized them as permanent measures of their identity.
So the C+ doesn't mean I struggled with this material. It means I am stupid. The parking ticket doesn't mean I parked too close to the hydrant. It means I am incompetent.
And the friend brushing them off means, "I am unlovable." The distinction is that the event becomes a verdict on their permanent traits.
What's fascinating here is how the fixed mindset creates this constant, agonizing need for validation. Every situation is evaluated through a very specific binary lens.
Will I look smart or dumb? Will I succeed or fail? Will I be accepted or rejected?
Because they believe their traits are permanent, they literally cannot afford a single misstep. A misstep is a permanent stain.
On the other hand, the individuals who tested dominant in the growth mindset faced the exact same hypothetical scenario and yielded completely different data.
Their responses were much more action-oriented.
Entirely. They said things like, "The C+ tells me I need to adjust my study habits for this class. I need to pay the ticket right away. And I should check in on my friend later to see if they were having a bad day."
They didn't label themselves as losers. They identified the friction points and proposed strategies to navigate them. It reminds me of the underlying narrative structure of the movie Groundhog Day.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Think about Bill Murray's character, Phil Connors. He's the cynical, arrogant weatherman who gets trapped repeating the exact same day in Punxsutawney. For the first act of the movie, he is essentially operating in a fixed mindset paradise.
Because he uses the infinite time loop to manipulate the people around him.
Exactly. Gathering information one day so he can appear effortlessly brilliant the next. He learns a woman's favorite French poetry just to recite it back to her and prove his intellectual superiority.
He wants to be perceived as a god. flawless and omniscient.
But despite achieving that superficial validation, he falls into a deep suicidal depression. The validation doesn't sustain him because it requires constant, exhausting maintenance.
And it ultimately isolates him.
Totally. He only breaks the time loop when he abandons the need to prove his superiority and shifts entirely into a growth mindset. He stops performing for ego validation and starts utilizing the infinite time to actually learn.
He endures the excruciating, repetitive failure of learning to play the piano until he becomes a master.
Yes. And he studies the complex schedule of the town's accidents so he can run around genuinely catching a kid falling from a tree or saving a man from choking. He stops asking, how can I look smart today? And starts asking, what can I learn and how can I help?
That structural pivot is what ultimately sets him free from the loop. It's a compelling cultural artifact that perfectly mirrors the clinical findings. The fixed mindset traps you in a repetitive loop of attempting to prove your worth, while the growth mindset allows you to synthesize experiences and evolve.
And this begs a question for you, the listener, to actively consider as we move forward. When things get hard, when you encounter friction in your own life, like a difficult project or a critical piece of feedback, do you feel like your underlying intelligence is being judged?
Or do you perceive it as an opportunity for your brain to build new neural pathways?
Because the answer to that question dictates the entire trajectory of how you approach challenges. And we see that trajectory established incredibly early in life.
We really do. The research shows how these mindsets actively alter decision-making processes even in early childhood. Let's look at the study involving 4-year-olds.
Okay, set this one up for us.
The researchers brought these children in and offered them a very simple choice. They could redo an easy jigsaw puzzle that they had already successfully completed, or they could try a brand new, harder puzzle.
At 4 years old.
Yes, and the divergence was already clear. The children who leaned toward a fixed mindset overwhelmingly chose the safe, easy puzzle.
Just to protect themselves.
Exactly. One child actually explicitly articulated the reasoning, stating, "Kids who are born smart don't do mistakes."
That is heartbreaking. At 4 years old, that child has already internalized the concept that making a mistake is a threat to their identity as smart.
They chose the immediate, guaranteed validation of repeating a known success over the risk of learning something new.
Meanwhile, the children exhibiting a growth mindset were thoroughly confused by the premise of the question.
They couldn't fathom why anyone would want to do a puzzle they had already solved.
They actively demanded the harder puzzles. One girl emphatically stated she was dying to figure them out. The easy puzzle offered no value to them because it offered no friction and therefore no learning.
And this avoidance of friction doesn't magically disappear as we age. It merely becomes more sophisticated and carries much higher stakes.
Let's talk about the Hong Kong University study, because this one is wild.
It is. This is a prestigious institution where all classes, textbooks, and examinations are conducted entirely in English.
But for many arriving freshmen, English is not their primary language.
Right. And a lack of fluency presents a massive, immediate barrier to their academic survival. So the researchers identified the arriving students who scored poorly on English proficiency tests and presented them with a crucial question.
If the faculty offered a remedial course to help you improve your English skills, would you enroll?
Now, logically, the answer has to be yes.
Of course, your entire college career depends on understanding the language of instruction.
But psychologically, the responses were split perfectly along the lines of mindset. The students measured with a growth mindset gave an emphatic yes. They recognized a deficiency, saw a tool to correct it, and opted to use the tool.
But the students who measured with a fixed mindset,
Overwhelmingly said no.
which is astounding, they were literally willing to risk their entire college career just to avoid looking deficient in the short term.
Enrolling in a remedial class meant publicly admitting they lacked a skill. And in the fixed mindset, lacking a skill is a permanent indictment. They chose long-term sabotage over short-term vulnerability.
To understand the physical mechanics of why someone would make such a self-destructive choice, we have to look at the neurobiological data.
Yes, the Columbia University study. This is where it gets incredibly concrete.
They used an EEG, right?
They did. Researchers brought individuals into a brainwave lab, hooked them up to an electroencephalogram, and monitored their brainwave activity in real time as they answered difficult trivia questions and received feedback.
Okay, let me interject here with a skeptical perspective.
Go for it.
If I am hooked up to an EEG and answering hard questions, my brain is naturally going to show heightened activity when the researcher tells me if I got the answer right or wrong. We are wired to care about the outcome. How does an EEG differentiate between a normal reaction to a score and a fixed mindset flaw?
That's a great question.
Mm,
The differentiation lies in the sequence of the brain wave spikes, specifically when the brain chooses to engage and when it chooses to disengage.
okay.
You're correct that everyone's brain showed activity when receiving the initial verdict of right or wrong, but the crucial data emerged in the milliseconds after that verdict.
What happened?
For the individuals with a fixed mindset, their brain waves spiked dramatically when they were told if their answer was correct or incorrect. They were highly attentive to the ego validation.
Right.
However, immediately after that, when the researchers presented the actual correct answer or the explanatory information that could help them learn the material, their brainwave activity flatlined.
Wow.
There was no sign of interest. Their brains literally stopped processing the external input.
Because the verdict had already been delivered, the trial was over. If they got it right, they were smart and they didn't need to listen anymore. If they got it wrong, they were dumb and the information was just a painful reminder of their failure, so they tuned it out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The learning mechanism shut down entirely.
And the growth mindset group.
Conversely, the individuals with a growth mindset exhibited sustained, deep attention and high brainwave activity, not just during the verdict, but critically during the presentation of the corrective information.
They wanted to know why they got it wrong.
Yes, they remained neurologically engaged with the material because their primary objective was to acquire the knowledge, regardless of whether their initial answer was right or wrong.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. That neurological prioritization of validation over growth bleeds directly into our interpersonal lives.
Particularly in how we select our romantic partners.
Yes. The research delves into how young adults conceptualize their ideal mate, and the findings are a direct reflection of that EEG data.
Individuals with a fixed mindset described an ideal partner as someone who would put them on a pedestal.
Worship them, make them feel flawless.
Exactly. They are seeking a partner whose primary function is to serve as a mirror, constantly reflecting back and validating their fixed qualities. They want a relationship free of friction.
But individuals with a growth mindset articulated a completely different desire. They wanted a partner who would challenge them.
Someone who would perceive their faults and constructively help them address them. They sought someone who would encourage them to acquire new skills and essentially act as a catalyst for their ongoing development.
There's a striking narrative in the research regarding a specific marriage where these two paradigms violently collided.
The woman with the growth mindset and the husband with the fixed mindset.
Yes. She detailed how every single attempt at basic relational maintenance turned into a psychological crisis. If she suggested they needed to communicate better or asked him to consult her before making unilateral decisions, he didn't process it as actionable feedback.
He processed it as a devastating attack on his inherent worth as a husband.
The emotional labor in that dynamic is incredibly asymmetric. Instead of addressing the actual logistical or emotional issue she raised, she found herself spending hours repairing the collateral damage to his ego.
She had to meticulously reassure him of his perfection before they could even approach the topic.
And frequently, he would just retreat from the conversation entirely. He'd call his mother, who predictably provided the uncritical blanket adoration he required to stabilize his identity.
One partner views the relationship as a collaborative project requiring constant adjustment and learning.
And the other views it as a static monument that must simply be admired.
And this demand to be placed on a pedestal isn't isolated to domestic life. When this exact psychological profile is elevated to the executive suite of a corporation, it is diagnosed as CEO disease.
CEO disease.
It's the phenomenon where a leader systematically purges critics, surrounds themselves with sycophants, and isolates themselves from any data that contradicts their genius.
We are going to examine the corporate fallout of that a bit later. But the through line from the 4-year-old with the puzzle, to the husband on the phone with his mother, to the CEO in the boardroom, it is unbroken.
That unbroken line brings us to a pervasive societal illusion that reinforces the fixed mindset, the myth of the natural.
Society loves the idea of effortless perfection. We really do. We're deeply attracted to the narrative that true greatness is innate, like a divine spark bestowed upon a chosen few.
We like to believe that Mozart simply emerged from the womb, transcribing fully formed symphonies, or that athletic superstars operate outside the laws of standard human physics.
It's a compelling mythological narrative, but the historical and biographical data thoroughly dismantle it. Let's look at Charles Darwin.
The cultural shorthand is that he was a lone, innate genius who had a sudden, brilliant epiphany while looking at a finch.
Right, But the reality is that his masterwork on the origin of species was the result of agonizing labor. It required years of grueling fieldwork,
Hundreds of collaborative discussions with mentors and peers.
countless flawed preliminary drafts, and over half a lifetime of relentless, grinding dedication before the theory reached its finalized form. It wasn't an epiphany at all. It was an endurance test.
The same principle applies to the visual arts. Take Paul Cézanne. He is historically credited with bridging the gap between late 19th century Impressionism and Cubism.
But his early paintings were actually pretty bad.
They were roundly criticized as overwrought, stiff, and objectively poor.
And Jackson Pollock. He revolutionized modern art with his drip technique, but he possessed very little native, traditional talent. Art historians who evaluate his early student work generally agree it shows no special innate gift.
What Pollock possessed was an absolute singular obsession with the medium.
He thought about it incessantly, experimented relentlessly, and dedicated thousands of hours to mastering his physical relationship with the canvas until he produced something startlingly original.
But nowhere is the myth of the natural more entrenched than in the world of professional sports.
Oh, absolutely. The entire scouting infrastructure is often built around identifying the physical specimen who doesn't seem to need to exert effort. Let's talk about Billy Beane.
The Moneyball story.
Exactly. If you look at Beane's early life, he was the definition of a physical natural. By his sophomore year in high school, he was the highest scorer on the basketball team, the quarterback of the football team, and the best hitter on the baseball team, batting an absurd .500.
Scouts viewed him as the next Babe Ruth. He was drafted in the first round by the New York Mets. He had every conceivable physical advantage.
He had the physical tools, but he entirely lacked the psychological architecture of a champion. Beane was deeply entrenched in a fixed mindset. Because his early successes came so effortlessly, he never learned how to process failure.
He internalized the belief that his natural talent dictated that he should never make an out.
So when he advanced to the major leagues and the level of pitching parity increased, he naturally encountered inevitable friction. And when he struck out, it wasn't just a mechanical error to be analyzed.
It was a nightmare of humiliation.
He went to pieces at the plate. He would break bats, throw helmets, and spiral into deep funks. He couldn't even go to the batting cage to analyze his swing mechanics and practice them away because the very act of needing to practice terrified him.
Because it implied his natural talent was flawed.
Meanwhile, he watched his teammate, Lenny Dykstra. Dykstra did not possess a fraction of Beane's innate physical endowment.
But Dykstra had a wildly different psychological makeup.
He had absolutely no concept of failure as an identity. When Dykstra struck out, he didn't care about looking foolish. He just cared about what the pitcher threw him so he could hit it the next time.
Beane ultimately recognized that his own career was destroyed by his psychological fragility, not a lack of physical ability. And in a fascinating pivot, he eventually utilized that painful realization to revolutionize baseball management.
As the general manager of the Oakland Athletics?
Yes, he stopped drafting players based on the traditional subjective evaluations of natural talent and started drafting based on specific, objective statistical output and psychological resilience.
He built a team that prioritized players who could work counts, take walks, and grind out at bats. Players who weren't afraid of the friction.
That analytical, mindset-driven approach is the foundation of the Moneyball philosophy, which allowed a team with one of the lowest payrolls in baseball to achieve a 103 victory season.
Let's shift from baseball to boxing. If we look at Muhammad Ali, we see the absolute inverse of Billy Beane's physical profile, but the pinnacle of the growth mindset.
Boxing has historically relied heavily on physical measurements, referred to as the tail of the tape, to identify natural fighters.
Right? Fist circumference, reach, chest expansion, weight distribution.
By these traditional metrics, Muhammad Ali was not considered a natural heavyweight. He failed the standard physical assessment.
And his technique was widely criticized as fundamentally wrong. He didn't keep his hands up to block punches, he frequently left his jaw exposed, and he pulled straight back to evade strikes instead of slipping laterally.
So when he was slated to fight Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship, the match was considered a dark joke. Liston was the archetype of the natural heavyweight. He possessed massive size, raw power, and a brutal dominating presence.
The public and the press were so convinced of Ali's imminent destruction that the arena in Miami Beach was only half full on the night of the fight.
Yet, Ollie won.
He won, and he didn't win by suddenly developing a heavier punch. He beat Liston by utilizing a superior psychological strategy.
Ollie recognized his physical deficits and compensated by studying Liston obsessively. He read his interviews, spoke with people in his orbit, and constructed a detailed psychological profile.
He deduced that Liston was a bully who relied on instilling terror, and that his greatest vulnerability was unpredictability. A knockout punch is the one you don't anticipate.
So Ollie spent the lead up to the fight acting completely erratic, feigning almost maniacal instability to convince Liston that he was dealing with an unpredictable madman.
And once in the ring, Ollie used his speed to evade, frustrating Liston, taking away his aura of invincibility and systematically breaking his will. As a prominent boxing manager later observed, Ollie proved that ultimate victories come from here, the brain, not just the fists.
Even the athletes we retroactively crown as the ultimate naturals utilized relentless effort to build their skills. Take Michael Jordan.
Universally recognized as the epitome of basketball perfection.
Yet his early career was defined by rejection. He was notoriously cut from his high school varsity team, and he wasn't heavily recruited by the dominant college programs of the era.
His genius wasn't just his vertical leap. It was his dogged, almost pathological dedication to practice. After a painful loss at the end of a college season while others went home, Jordan stayed on the court for hours running drills and refining his shot.
And what about Babe Ruth?
Oh, this is a great one. We associate him with an effortless, almost magical ability to hit home runs, often accompanied by stories of his prodigious appetites for hot dogs and beer.
He certainly didn't have the chiseled physique of a modern athlete. But that mythology obscures the reality of his work ethic. When his career was threatened by a slump, he didn't just rely on his natural swing.
He spent the entire offseason engaged in a rigorous, grueling physical conditioning program at a local gym to salvage his career.
And when he first arrived in the major leagues with the Red Sox, the veteran players actually resented him. Not because he was a cocky natural, but because he constantly demanded extra batting practice.
Much to their annoyance, he relentlessly experimented with his grip and his stance, actively learning how to control his massive swing through trial and error.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, society's obsession with effortless perfection actually hurts people. The sources highlight the fable of the tortoise and the hare as a cultural touchstone that inadvertently reinforces a damaging lesson.
We are taught the moral that slow and steady wins the race, which ostensibly champions effort. But if we are honest, no one actually wants to identify as the plodding, untalented tortoise.
Culturally, we all want to be the hare. We just want to be a hare who is smart enough not to fall asleep during the race.
It's so true. The fable accidentally frames effort as the exclusive domain of the untalented. It suggests that if you have to work hard, it's only because you lack the innate brilliance of the hare.
In the fixed mindset, needing to try hard is the ultimate indictment. If you are a true genius, you shouldn't have to sweat.
And that specific fear of effort can result in absolute paralysis, even for highly talented individuals. Look at the violinist Nadja Salerno-Sonnenberg.
By any measure, she was an extraordinary prodigy. She made her violin debut at the Philadelphia Orchestra at the age of 10.
But when she subsequently arrived at the Juilliard School to study under the legendary instructor Dorothy DeLay, she brought with her a profound psychological barrier. She possessed a repertoire of awful mechanical habits.
She held the instrument incorrectly, her fingerings were inefficient and awkward.
But when DeLay attempted to correct these flaws, Salerno-Sonnenberg adamantly refused to alter her technique or apply the necessary effort to relearn the mechanics.
And as the years progressed, and the other students who were diligently practicing began to surpass her, she experienced a severe crisis of confidence.
She stopped practicing altogether. Eventually, she stopped even bringing her violin to her lessons.
The psychological mechanism at play here is the ultimate fixed mindset defense strategy. If you rely solely on your natural talent, go to an audition, put in half the effort, and fail, your ego remains intact.
You can rationalize the failure. You just tell yourself, I didn't really try. If I had tried, I would have won. The lack of effort provides a protective alibi for your talent.
But if you strip away that alibi, if you try your absolute hardest, commit every ounce of your energy, and still fail, you have no excuses left.
It is an honest, undeniable failure, and in the fixed mindset, that means you simply aren't good enough. It's the ultimate fear. If you try your absolute hardest and still fail, what then?
Her teacher, Dorothy DeLay, finally recognized that the only way to save Salerno-Sonnenberg's career was to force a confrontation with this fear.
She threatened to drop her from the class entirely if she didn't commit to the work.
Stripped of her comfortable alibi, Salerno-Sonnenberg finally engaged the effort. She painstakingly unlearned her bad habits, refined her technique, and subsequently won a prestigious upcoming competition.
She realized that the deepest satisfaction doesn't come from effortless execution, but from working aggressively toward the mastery of something you love.
That transition from avoiding effort to embracing it leads us directly into how these distinct psychological frameworks process the concept of failure itself.
Let's talk about the meaning of failure. Because in the growth mindset, failure is acknowledged as a painful experience. It's a severe logistical or emotional setback. It is not minimized.
However, it is fundamentally categorized as a problem to be analyzed, faced, and learned from.
But in the fixed mindset, failure undergoes a catastrophic transformation. It shifts from being an action, I failed at this task, to becoming a permanent identity. I am a failure.
The tragic biography of Bernard Loiseau illustrates the lethal potential of this identity shift. Loiseau was not a marginal figure. He was one of the preeminent chefs in the world.
An absolute pioneer of nouvelle cuisine in France.
His restaurant in Burgundy had achieved the culinary world's most coveted accolade, the supreme rating of 3 stars from the Michelin Guide. He had built a massive culinary empire based on this perfection.
But the architecture of that empire rested on the fragile foundation of continuous external validation. The crisis occurred when his restaurant lost 2 points in a different restaurant guide, the Gault Millau,
Dropping his score from a 19 to a 17 out of 20.
Concurrently, rampant rumors began circulating in the press that he was at risk of losing one of his 3 Michelin stars in the upcoming edition of the guide.
To be clear, he had not actually lost the Michelin star.
Right. But the mere specter of that demotion, the slight downgrade in the secondary guide, was enough to trigger a total psychological collapse.
The fixed mindset took this potential professional setback and converted it into a total invalidation of his worth. He couldn't separate the rating of the restaurant from his right to exist.
Unable to bear the shame of this newly assigned identity as a failure, he committed suicide. It is a devastating reality that a man of such tremendous energy, talent, and historical impact was completely unmade because a fractional shift in a rating system redefined him.
It is a harrowing example of how high the internal stakes are for someone trapped in that framework. Now, contrast that catastrophic internalization of failure with the experience of Jim Marshall.
Defensive player for the Minnesota Vikings.
Yes, Marshall experienced what is arguably the most publicly humiliating blunder in the history of professional sports.
During a game against the San Francisco 49ers on national TV.
He scooped up a fumble and, in the chaos of the moment, became disoriented. He ran the football entirely in the wrong direction, crossing his own goal line and scoring a safety for the opposing team.
The level of public shame is almost incomprehensible. He actually threw the ball out of the end zone in celebration, only to have an opposing player thank him for the points.
If he were operating in a fixed mindset, that is a career-ending, identity-destroying moment. You would fake an injury, hide in the locker room, and never speak of it again.
But Marshall's response at halftime was completely analytical and forward-facing. He later stated his thought process was simply, if you make a mistake, you've got to make it right.
He didn't allow the mistake to define his character. He returned to the field for the second half, played brilliantly, and actually made a critical play that helped his team secure the victory.
And the growth mindset didn't stop when the clock ran out. He actively utilized the experience. He began speaking to groups about resilience.
He personally answered letters from individuals who had experienced severe public shaming or failure.
He integrated the incident into his leadership style. He weaponized his own humiliation to become a better person and a more effective leader.
This stark contrast in how failure is processed brings us to the most counterintuitive and frankly alarming study in the entire stack of research.
The danger of praise.
Yes. Society operates on the deeply held assumption that praising a child's inherent ability builds their self-esteem and immunizes them against failure.
We are told constantly to remind children how smart and talented they are. But Dweck's clinical data proves that this specific type of praise is actually highly destructive.
Let's break down the methodology because it's crucial. The researchers gathered hundreds of early adolescent students and administered a baseline assessment consisting of 10 fairly difficult problems derived from a nonverbal IQ test.
And the majority of the students performed quite well.
Right. Following the test, the researchers introduced the independent variable, the specific phrasing of the praise.
They divided the students into 2 groups. The first group was praised exclusively for their ability. The researchers said, "Wow, you got 8 right. That's a really good score. You must be smart at this."
The second group was praised exclusively for their effort, The researcher said, wow, you got 8 right. That's a really good score. You must have worked really hard.
Such a minor difference in phrasing. But the divergence in the students' subsequent behavior was immediate. By simply labeling the first group as smart, the researchers instantly pushed those students into a fixed mindset.
In the very next phase of the study, the students were offered a choice between a challenging new task that they could learn from or a safe task similar to what they had just completed.
The ability-praised students overwhelmingly rejected the challenging task.
Because they had just been handed the pristine label of smart, and they recognized that attempting a harder task carried the risk of making a mistake and losing that label. They chose stagnation to protect their newly defined talent.
But the effort-praised students reacted entirely differently. Because their praise was tied to the process of working hard, not a static identity, they embraced the friction. 90% of the effort-praised group chose the challenging new task.
Because they wanted to continue the process of learning.
Then, the researchers introduced a deliberate failure state. They gave all the students a set of highly difficult problems that they were virtually guaranteed to struggle with.
The ability-praised kids were devastated. The difficulty immediately signaled to them that they weren't actually smart after all. Their confidence plummeted, their enjoyment of the task vanished.
And critically, when the researchers later reintroduced easier problems, their performance plummeted. It was significantly worse than when they started. The failure had degraded their baseline cognitive function.
But the effort-praised students perceived the difficulty not as an indictment of their intelligence, but simply as a signal that the task required more effort. They remained engaged, and their performance on subsequent tests continued to steadily improve.
But the most disturbing data point came at the very end of the study: the lying. This is the part that completely upends standard parenting advice.
The researchers informed the students that they were going to share the results of the study with students at other schools. They handed the participants a blank sheet of paper and asked them to write down the scores they'd achieved on the tests.
Almost 40% of the kids who had been praised for their ability blatantly lied and artificially inflated their scores.
In the fixed mindset, imperfections are perceived as deeply shameful, especially if you've been publicly burdened with the label of being smart. To protect that fragile identity, they resorted to deceit.
So what does this all mean? We are essentially telling kids they are inherently brilliant, and in doing so, turning them into anxious liars who are terrified of a challenge.
We see the horrific weight of this genius label in the biographical account of Adam Gettle.
Getley is the grandson of the legendary composer Richard Rodgers. He possessed an undeniable, profound aptitude for musical theater, but from a very young age, he was burdened with the expectation of innate greatness.
Praised as a savior of the art form, a generational genius.
The pressure of maintaining that fixed perfection became intolerable. The research notes that at age 13, he was scheduled to perform in a high-profile opera broadcast, but he faked a voice change to back out because he couldn't manage the psychological terror of potentially underperforming.
As he grew older, the anxiety manifested physically and psychologically. He developed severe obsessive-compulsive tics and engaged in a prolonged, brutal battle with drug addiction.
Gittell actually explicitly articulated the trap he was in. He said, "In my family, to be good is to fail. To be very good is to fail. The only thing not a failure is to be great."
The positive label of genius didn't empower him. It filled him with paralyzing doubt, and he spent a significant portion of his life attempting to numb or run away from his own potential.
This structural understanding of how labels operate is vital because it explains the mechanics of negative labels as well. We see this vividly in Claude Steele's groundbreaking research on stereotype threat.
Steele investigated how societal stereotypes actively suppress cognitive performance. He found that simply asking a student to check a demographic box indicating their race or gender immediately prior to taking a standardized test can trigger a stereotype in their mind,
Resulting in a significant, measurable drop in their test scores.
If you prime a female student with her gender before a rigorous mathematics exam, or an African American student with their race before a test framed as a measure of innate intelligence, their performance degrades.
The stereotype hijacks their cognitive bandwidth, filling their working memory with distracting anxieties about potentially confirming a negative societal assumption.
But what the intersection of Dweck and Steele's research reveals is that this cognitive hijacking primarily debilitates individuals operating within a fixed mindset.
If you hold a fixed mindset, a negative societal stereotype isn't just an external bias. It is a threat of permanent biological inferiority. It whispers that you and your group are inherently unchangeably incapable. That is a psychologically terrifying prospect that naturally crushes performance.
However, individuals who are anchored in a growth mindset demonstrate remarkable resilience against stereotype threat. They don't magically become blind to the prejudice, they see the bias clearly.
But they do not believe in the concept of permanent inherent inferiority. They view the stereotype not as a definitive verdict on their biological worth, but as an external barrier, a friction point to be overcome through strategy and effort.
They maintain their sense of belonging and actively fight back against the narrative by focusing on the process of mastery.
Let's pull the lens back and examine what happens when these psychological frameworks are scaled up to a macroeconomic level. We need to talk about business, leadership, and the talent mindset. Let's talk about Enron.
In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Enron was a corporate phenomenon, and its internal culture was heavily shaped by McKinsey and Company, the premier management consulting firm of the era.
McKinsey pushed a corporate philosophy they termed the talent mindset.
The core thesis of the talent mindset was that corporate supremacy was achieved solely by recruiting the absolute best innate, raw talent, sparing no financial expense to acquire them, and then rapidly promoting them based on perceived brilliance rather than steady development.
Enron internalized this completely. They became obsessed with academic pedigree and perceived intellectual horsepower, paying astronomical salaries to construct a workforce they believed consisted entirely of absolute geniuses.
But the architecture of that philosophy mandates a fixed mindset. If a corporation explicitly tells you that you are being paid millions of dollars exclusively because you are an infallible genius, you are structurally forbidden from making a mistake.
Enron instituted a brutal performance review system known as rank and yank, where employees were constantly graded against each other and the bottom percentage was routinely fired.
This system created an environment of sheer terror. Employees had to constantly project an image of flawless, effortless brilliance.
Consequently, when these geniuses inevitably encountered complex structural problems, bad investments, or knowledge gaps, they couldn't admit it. Admitting a deficiency would mean they weren't the talent they were hired to be, leading to immediate termination.
They couldn't consult with colleagues, they couldn't ask clarifying questions, and they certainly couldn't stand before investors and admit a strategic error.
So, much like the ability praised children in the IQ study who inflated their scores, the executives at Enron chose to systematically lie. They manipulated the accounting, hid the debt in complex shell companies, and perpetuated a massive fraud.
Because the corporate culture structurally prohibited the admission of error required to self-correct.
The company literally could not correct its deficiencies because nobody was allowed to acknowledge that any deficiencies existed. The fixed mindset destroyed a multi-billion-dollar corporation from the inside out.
Now, contrast that disastrous collapse with the extensive research conducted by Jim Collins for his book, Good to Great. Collins and his team engaged in a massive data analysis project to identify companies that successfully made the leap from being average to generating truly exceptional, sustained market dominance.
Collins initially hypothesized that the catalyst for these transformations would be the arrival of preening, larger-than-life, charismatic rock star CEOs who came in and imposed their visionary genius on the company.
But the data completely contradicted that assumption. The CEOs who successfully orchestrated these massive long-term transformations were overwhelmingly characterized by a profound growth mindset.
They were often self-effacing, quiet, and possessed an intense desire to learn rather than to command. They were defined by their willingness to face uncomfortable realities.
Look at Alan Wurtzel, the CEO responsible for the massive turnaround of Circuit City. He didn't walk into the boardroom claiming to have all the answers.
He was actually internally nicknamed the prosecutor because his primary management tool was relentless inquiry. He would constantly badger his executive board with questions. Why are we doing it this way? Why is this metric falling? Why is this competitor succeeding where we are failing?
He had zero interest in protecting an aura of executive omniscience. His sole objective was to aggressively acquire the factual data necessary to navigate the company's future.
And we can juxtapose Wurtzel's approach with the leadership style of Lee Iacocca, who serves as the ultimate case study of an executive constrained by a fixed mindset.
When Iacocca was a rising star at Ford Motor Company, his primary psychological drive was ascending to what he viewed as his rightful place as the crown prince of the corporation.
When Henry Ford II abruptly fired him, the rejection was intolerable to his ego. He couldn't process it as a business dispute or an opportunity for self-reflection. It was a permanent existential stain on his greatness.
So he aggressively pivoted to the Chrysler Corporation with the explicit, almost vengeful goal of saving the failing company to prove his heroism and invalidate Ford's judgment.
And initially, his strategy was incredibly successful. He secured the government bailout, restructured the debt, released new vehicles. He became a cultural superstar.
But once the immediate crisis was resolved and his genius was validated, the fixed mindset became a severe liability.
Instead of utilizing the newfound stability to invest heavily in long-term engineering innovations to compete with the rising dominance of Japanese automakers who were meticulously iterating and building superior cars, Yukoka focused on protecting his image.
He spent millions of corporate dollars renovating his personal executive suite at the Waldorf Astoria. He demanded that the government impose protective tariffs to artificially shield Chrysler from superior international competition, rather than doing the hard work of improving his own product.
And most tellingly, he aggressively refused to groom any viable successors. A growth-minded leader builds a robust infrastructure that outlasts them. But in Yukoka's fixed mindset paradigm, grooming a brilliant successor would require acknowledging that he wasn't the only genius capable of running the company.
He actively suppressed internal talent to ensure he remained the sole savior, ultimately sacrificing the long-term viability of Chrysler to protect his personal mythology.
The clinical mechanics of this leadership dichotomy were beautifully isolated in a study conducted by researchers Wood and Bandura. They designed a simulated environment where graduate business students were tasked with managing a fictional furniture manufacturing company.
They divided the students into two groups and subtly manipulated their initial paradigms. They primed one group with a fixed mindset, explicitly telling them that the simulation was a rigorous assessment of their underlying innate management capabilities.
And they primed the second group with a growth mindset, informing them that complex management skills are acquired progressively through practice and experiential learning.
Because the simulation was designed to be deliberately difficult, both groups of students struggled significantly in the initial phases. They made poor resource allocations and failed to meet production quotas.
But the divergence in how they responded to that early friction was stark.
The students primed with the fixed mindset completely stagnated. Because they believed the simulation was an immediate verdict on their innate ability, their early mistakes paralyzed them. They became defensive, stuck to their failing strategies rather than admitting error, and their overall productivity plummeted.
However, the students primed with the growth mindset perceived the early failures as valuable diagnostic feedback. They analyzed the data from their mistakes, continuously altered their operational strategies, and wildly increased the simulated company's productivity.
This data thoroughly dismantles the traditional corporate model of the genius with 1,000 helpers. Leaders operating in a fixed mindset don't want to build dynamic teams of independent thinkers who might challenge their assumptions.
Because that threatens their status as the smartest person in the room. They don't build teams. They cultivate audiences to applaud their directives.
True growth mindset leaders actively seek to surround themselves with individuals who are more capable than they are in specific areas, fostering an environment where friction and debate elevate the entire organization.
Synthesizing this massive volume of information spanning the behavioral anomalies of 4-year-olds, the neurological data from Columbia University, the psychological warfare of Muhammad Ali, the tragic collapse of Bernard Lizzo, and the structural failures of Enron, it brings us to a singular, unifying conclusion.
And it is a conclusion that places the agency entirely back in your hands. We have systematically explored how the fixed mindset transforms individuals into defensive non-learners, compelling them to hide from failure, falsify their achievements, and actively cap their own potential because the psychological cost of stretching is too high.
Conversely, we have observed the mechanics of how the growth mindset architects resilience. It allows individuals to interpret failure not as an identity, but as a data point, empowering them to relentlessly push past perceived limitations.
The critical takeaway for you, listening to this right now, is that mindsets are fundamentally just beliefs. They exert a massive gravitational pull on your behavior, yes, but they are entirely cognitive constructs. You have the structural capacity to change your mind.
The application of this research requires active, continuous reflection. The next time you hit a wall, feel depressed, or face a negative stereotype, don't ask, "Am I smart enough to do this?"
Ask, what specific strategy can I employ to extract learning from this failure? What actionable steps can I take to systematically improve my capability in this area?
It is a deliberate daily practice of auditing your own reactions, catching yourself retreating into the safety of the fixed mindset, and forcing the neurological pivot toward growth.
Which leads us to a final, profound implication of this research. We've talked about how individuals function with these mindsets, but think about the very structures of our society. Examine our educational grading systems, our corporate annual performance reviews, the way we give out awards.
Almost all of them are built entirely on a fixed mindset paradigm, rewarding the final outcome rather than the trajectory of learning.
If we took the growth mindset to its absolute logical conclusion, how would we have to completely dismantle and rebuild the way our society measures human worth? That is something for you to explore on your own.
That is a massive architectural thought experiment to leave you with. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep analyzing your friction points, keep demanding the hard puzzles, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.